Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
It was the kind of morning that smelled like fresh paint and expensive hardwood floors, the sort of day that seemed staged for a magazine photo shoot, and I was playing the role of the helpful older sister who doesn't flinch when her mother ignores her. My parents had arrived before me, of course, Dad already hauling boxes, sweating through his t-shirt, and Mom floating around the new condo like it was Versailles. Melanie had done well, sure, I'll give her that. This place was a penthouse unit with cathedral ceilings, marble countertops, and one of those absurd refrigerators that dispenses crushed ice, cubed ice, and filtered water that tastes like air. I carried a box labeled guest bathroom, which was funny in itself, since I'd never once had a guest bathroom in my life, and I walked past my mother admiring the crown molding, like it was the Sistine Chapel. She reached out to touch it like it might kiss her fingers back. "Oh, Melanie," she said, her voice just a breath, soft and syrupy. "You deserve this. You deserve more than anyone." She didn't know I was behind her. Or maybe she did. Maybe that's why she said it. It wasn't the first time she'd praised my sister like that, with that loaded admiration. But something in her voice this time, it stuck like a splinter under my skin. I stopped for a second, just in the hallway, the box in my arms suddenly heavier, and I wondered if Melanie heard it too, if she'd flinch, maybe say, "Hey, Mom, Carla helped too." But no, Melanie just smiled, that soft, slow smile that always seemed to pull everyone in like a riptide. I set the box down on the tiled floor and said nothing. Not because I didn't have anything to say. Trust me, I had plenty, but because I knew the moment I opened my mouth, everything would shatter. And I didn't want pieces. Not yet. Lunch was catered, of course. Little finger sandwiches and champagne flutes filled with orange mimosas that tasted like Sunday privilege. Mom sat at the head of the table, talking about how hard Melanie had worked to get here, how proud she was that her daughter had finally made it. I was right there, sitting next to her. I'd made it too, in a different way. I owned a modest home, worked full-time, paid my own bills since 21. Never once asked them for a penny. But that wasn't what counted. You remember when Melanie won that marketing award, my mother asked no one in particular, beaming. She was only 23. She turned to me briefly and added, "You were in that, what was it, Carla? That nonprofit thing. Disaster recovery. I coordinated logistics after the floods." "Right," she said, clearly not listening. But Melanie's award was statewide, I think. I took a bite of cucumber sandwich and tasted nothing but my own tongue, pressed hard against the roof of my mouth. Here's the thing. I was used to this. This wasn't new. From the moment Melanie came out blonde and blinking at the world, it was like she'd been dipped in honey. Everyone wanted to stick around her. I was the darker one, darker hair, darker humor, darker moods. I didn't sparkle. I didn't coo. I didn't need to be told what I was worth because I already knew I'd never be worth as much as her. Growing up, Melanie got piano lessons, dance class, braces when she was 12. I got library cards, hand-me-downs, and my dad's old Walkman with one working headphone. But I didn't complain. I just learned to sit in the back seat and let the golden child shine. By the time we were in our 30s, I'd long accepted the hierarchy. But that day, that whisper, something about it was too clean, too smug, too sure. It echoed in my skull long after we'd finished moving the last box and Mom had said her goodbyes with that same dramatic flair she reserved for people she didn't really know. Melanie hugged me and told me to come over anytime, but we both knew I wouldn't. We never hung out unless Mom arranged it. We weren't close. Never had been. And that wasn't anyone's fault. Not really. It just happened when one sister grows up drowning in attention and the other learns how to breathe without it. I got into my car and slammed the door harder than I needed to. The air was hot, stale with sweat and silence. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. Let the quiet wrap around me like a too small blanket. Then I reached for the glove box. I hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. Inside was a crumpled napkin, a dried-out pen, and the small jewelry box I'd tucked away 2 years ago and promised myself I'd never use. Next to it, folded carefully, was the faded envelope with my father's name written in my handwriting, the kind you only use when you're trying to keep your hand from shaking. I picked up the box and turned it over in my hand. It was velvet once, but now the corners were worn and the clasp was loose. It still held what I'd hidden, not a piece of jewelry, but something older. Something heavier. I stared at the envelope. I didn't open it. Not yet. But I knew I would. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But the second my mother whispered that line, "She deserves more than anyone," the clock started ticking. And I've never been good at waiting. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, if I stacked up enough ribbons and plaques and framed certificates, maybe one day I'd hear my mother talk about me the way she talked about Melanie, with that soft pride that curled at the edge of her mouth like lipstick. I thought maybe if I brought home enough perfect spelling tests or stood on enough little wooden stages in school cafeterias, she'd finally look at me the way she looked at Melanie when she wore her dance recital costumes, sequined and small, whirling like a toy ballerina while Mom filmed every second on her camcorder. I remember the first time I placed in regionals for the spelling bee, 4th grade. Word was Pharaoh, and I still remember the crowd clapping, that tiny plastic trophy cutting into my palms because I wouldn't let go of it, as if the weight of it might force some recognition. But Mom never made it to the event. She said Melanie had a dentist appointment and traffic was bad, and besides, it's not like it was state level or anything. That line stuck to me like gum under a desk, useless and annoying and impossible to scrape off without damage. Even when I showed her the trophy, she smiled politely like a stranger's kid had won something unimportant. Then she reminded me Melanie had just gotten her braces off, and how beautiful her smile looked now. It never stopped. Middle school turned into high school, and high school into college, and every moment I thought might be mine somehow got rewritten in the family narrative as background noise. I got a scholarship, not a full ride, but enough to pay for half of my tuition. I worked part-time, every evening, folding sweaters and cleaning fitting rooms at the local mall. I made the dean's list 3 years in a row. I was quiet about it, hoping maybe my accomplishments would speak loud enough without me having to shout. But it turns out silence doesn't echo in families like mine. It just vanishes. Meanwhile, Melanie failed out of her first college. Partied too much, said it was just not a good fit. My parents never mentioned it again. By spring, she was enrolled somewhere else, private this time, more expensive, more elite sounding. They paid her tuition without blinking. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself being self-sufficient was its own kind of pride, the kind that didn't need banners or champagne toasts or engraved picture frames. But I would be lying if I said it didn't chip away at me, little by little, like a slow leak under the floorboards. Because eventually, even the strongest foundations start to rot when the pressure keeps building and no one notices the water seeping in. The breaking point came after graduation. I'd been offered a position with a nonprofit that specialized in disaster logistics, and even though it wasn't glamorous or high-paying, it mattered to me. It was the kind of work that made me feel useful, like I was stitching something broken back together. I was ready to move out, to start a life of my own. I had been saving every penny since sophomore year, birthday money, job checks, even my tax refund. My parents had promised to help with a down payment. Nothing big, just a gesture. But then Melanie got engaged. And suddenly, all that money, the few thousand they'd saved for me, the little college leftover fund my dad used to mention casually when I was still filling out FAFSA forms, disappeared. They spent over $30,000 of my fund. I remember telling a friend over coffee, my voice even, too calm. That was almost half of my total tuition, nearly $50,000. Now maybe you're doing the math right now, and you're thinking that sounds off. And you'd be right. 30 isn't half of 50. I know. But when you're the invisible daughter, numbers stop mattering the way they should. It's not about math, it's about what they mean. And to me, That 30,000 meant this. Melanie's new condo mattered more than anything I had ever done. More than my sacrifices. More than my sleepless nights. More than me. When I asked my dad about it gently, hesitantly, like a stranger asking for directions, he rubbed his jaw like it was sore and said, "You're so responsible, Carla. We knew you'd be fine." That line didn't land like comfort. It landed like a weight tied to my ankles. Because being fine is the curse of every oldest child who never complains. We carry it all and say nothing, and the moment we speak up, we're told we're being dramatic. So I stayed quiet. I congratulated Melanie. I smiled through the engagement party. I handed her a card with a check inside and told her I was proud. But I wasn't proud. I was tired. And something in me had gone cold, like the lights had finally flickered off in a room no one ever bothered to enter anyway. That box in my glove compartment? It had stayed there for months. I never touched it. I told myself it wasn't time. I wasn't ready. But that night after the move, after the whisper, something shifted. Not rage. Not bitterness. Something quieter. Like still water before it boils. A few days later, my phone buzzed. It was my dad. "Hey," he said, too cheerful. "Your mother's planning a dinner next week. I think it's something special for Melanie again." I said nothing for a beat too long. He cleared his throat. "You'll come, won't you?" I told him I'd check my schedule, and for once I meant it. Because I wasn't sure what I'd bring to that dinner, a bottle of wine or something much heavier. There's a particular kind of silence that wraps around you at family dinners, not the warm or familiar kind that comes from comfort, but the sharp, metallic kind that settles in your mouth like a penny held under the tongue. That night, I wore a black blouse with sleeves too tight and a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, knowing full well this evening wasn't for me. It never was. My mother had called it a small gathering, though by the look of the polished silverware, the fresh floral centerpiece, and the way Melanie's name was printed on the little place cards, you'd think we were celebrating the coronation of a local queen. I arrived 5 minutes early because being punctual is something invisible daughters do instinctively, hoping, maybe stupidly, that responsibility might be noticed if it's repeated often enough. My mother opened the door with a swipe of lipstick on her teeth and a glass of Pinot already half gone in her hand. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, and after the briefest pause, she said, "Oh, you look nice," in the kind of tone you'd use to describe a reliable toaster. Inside, Melanie stood at the center of the living room like a trophy on display, laughing easily in that stage voice she always uses when there's an audience. She had a new haircut, a new watch, and a new something in her voice, a sharper edge I hadn't heard before, like she'd finally figured out she didn't even need to pretend she was humble anymore. We sat down at the table a few minutes later. The food was good, it always was, but I couldn't taste a single bite. My mother clinked her glass with a fork and stood up, a little tipsy, eyes shining like someone who'd just been told her life was finally turning out the way she'd always hoped. "I just want to say," she began, pausing to touch Melanie's shoulder in that too intimate, too possessive way she'd always done, "that I am so incredibly proud of my daughter. Melanie, you've worked so hard, and you've made all the right choices. You deserve every bit of this beautiful life you've built. You've become the most responsible daughter any mother could hope for." And just like that, the air went still inside my chest. I didn't choke. I didn't gasp. I didn't even blink. I just picked up my wine glass and stared into the deep red swirl of it like it might offer me some explanation, some distraction, something other than the white-hot roar in my ears that made it hard to swallow. My glass stayed full all night, untouched, but it felt heavier every time I looked at it. My father, sitting across from me, caught my eye once, just once, and I saw something flicker there. Guilt, maybe? Or regret. But he didn't speak up. He never did. Dad was always the quiet one, the gentle buffer between my mother's sharp edges and the rest of the world. But being quiet your whole life doesn't make you innocent. It just makes you complicit by default. Later, while Melanie and Mom cleared the table, which was a miracle in itself, considering Melanie hadn't done dishes since high school. I walked down the hallway and turned into the master bedroom. I didn't have to sneak. I knew the house better than my own heartbeat. I opened the drawer on the left side of the nightstand, not the right, because the right was where Dad kept his flashlights and gum wrappers and spare keys. The left was where he kept things that mattered. The velvet jewelry box fit perfectly in the corner of the drawer, tucked beside a leather-bound journal he hadn't written in since I was a teenager. I placed the envelope right on top of the box, angled slightly, like an invitation he hadn't yet received, but would know was meant for him. Then I shut the drawer, smoothed the blanket on the bed out of habit, and walked out without looking back. The rest of the night was a blur of decaf coffee and someone telling a story I didn't hear. I nodded when I was supposed to, smiled once when Melanie made a joke about my minimalist apartment, and said nothing when my mother kissed her on the cheek like she was blessing her for sainthood. When it was finally time to go, I stood up and reached for my coat. My father followed me to the front door, moving slower than usual, and just before I stepped outside into the cool night air, he touched my arm. He didn't say much, just pulled me into a hug that lasted too long for comfort and whispered into my ear, "You've always been different." I see that now. He didn't ask why I hadn't spoken all evening. He didn't apologize for what my mother said. He didn't ask about my life, or my work, or the years they pretended I didn't need anything because I was independent. But for once, he said something that cracked the surface. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just smiled, that same small smile I'd mastered over years of second-place ribbons and overlooked achievements, and I walked to my car knowing something had finally shifted. Not loudly, but deeply. It took him almost a full week to open the drawer, which didn't surprise me at all, because my father has always moved through emotional storms like an old fishing boat, quiet, slow, and just barely floating above the weight of everything left unsaid. I imagined the drawer staying closed for days, maybe opened once out of habit before he noticed something different tucked into the corner, something soft where there should have been paper clips or a forgotten receipt. That little velvet box wasn't loud or obvious, but it didn't belong, and even a man as passive as my father would eventually feel the itch to know what had shifted in his space. I don't know what he was doing when he found it. Maybe he was looking for spare batteries or that pocket knife he kept saying he lost years ago, but I do know, from the way his voice cracked later, that once he opened that drawer, the air in the room changed. I had thought 100 times about what would happen when he finally saw what I'd placed in his hands without ever saying a word. But still, I underestimated the stillness that must have dropped over that room, the kind that only comes when reality is finally heavier than denial. Inside the box, beneath the folded edges of the envelope I had addressed to him in ink that had started to fade, were 4 things. Each of them simple, each of them undeniable. The hospital bracelet was the first. A brittle plastic band with my name on it, Carla Jane Palmer, and a date of birth that should have meant something comforting. But it wasn't the bracelet that hurt, not really. It was the fact that taped underneath was a small sticky note that read, Room 3C, Temporary Nursery Assignment. That's a detail most parents would never need to question, never even think to remember. But he did because I made sure of it. The second item was a black and white photo, worn at the edges like it had lived in someone's wallet too long. It showed a woman in a hospital bed, my mother, holding a baby wrapped in a striped pink and blue blanket. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking to the left, at someone off frame, someone whose shadow just barely touched the corner of the image. That shadow didn't belong to my father, and he would have known that immediately. He would have known because he was out of town that weekend, attending a last-minute conference that had overlapped with my due date. He missed my birth by 16 hours and had carried that guilt for years like it was a scar he deserved to bear. And now, maybe, he'd wonder if that guilt had been placed in his chest for a reason he never saw coming. The third item was the birth certificate, a copy, not the original, but accurate in every way that mattered. Mother's name, June Palmer. Father's name, left blank. My real birth certificate had always listed him, of course, because that's what you do when you're building a life with someone and lies are easier than explanations. But this version, the one from the hospital's original logs, the one buried in a state record office, told the truth. No father listed. Just a long dash where love was supposed to be. And the final piece, folded 3 times and paperclipped at the corner, was the paternity test. I had taken it almost 2 years ago, back when those online DNA kits were more of a novelty than a warning shot. I wasn't looking for scandal. I didn't even suspect anything when I spat into that tube. I just wanted to know more about where I came from. The results didn't come with fireworks or dramatic music. Just a plain chart, a glaring void where I expected to see my father's name. No biological match. 0%. I never meant to use it. I filed it away, told myself it didn't matter because biology isn't love and names on documents don't raise children. But then my mother leaned close to Melanie's ear and whispered, she deserves more than anyone, and something in me uncoiled, something that had waited in the dark for far too long. When the call came that night, it wasn't angry, but it wasn't calm either. It was something in between, that shaky, hollow tone people use when they've just realized their life is no longer the same shape it was when they woke up that morning. His voice cracked like an old door hinge. "Carla," he said, pausing like my name suddenly meant something more than it ever had before. "We need to talk. I don't know what to believe." I didn't say anything right away, because what do you say to a man whose world just cracked open like an egg dropped on tile? I waited. Let the silence fill the space between us like water in a lung. When I finally answered, my voice was steadier than I expected. "Okay," I said. "Then let's talk." But I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. I didn't tell him what else I'd found while digging through names and dates and timelines that didn't add up. I didn't tell him that Melanie's birth certificate also had a dash where it shouldn't. I didn't tell him about the second test I'd ordered, or the results that had come back just 2 weeks before the condo celebration. He thought he'd opened Pandora's box. But that was just the lid. I never called him back, not because I didn't care, and not because I wanted to watch the world burn, at least not entirely, but because sometimes the cleanest form of revenge is silence. The kind that doesn't scream or accuse. The kind that just lets the truth speak for itself in a room full of echoes no one was prepared to hear. After he called that night and said those 6 words, "We need to talk," I don't know what to believe. I sat in my car in the dark, fingers hovering over the phone, staring at his name like it was a number I didn't recognize. The next morning, I printed everything. I didn't email it. I didn't send it from some untraceable burner account or drop it in his mailbox by hand like a coward or a coward dressed in courage. No, I mailed it the old-fashioned way, in a plain white envelope, typed, clean, clinical, anonymous in tone but impossible to misunderstand. DNA results, birth record copies, an annotated timeline I'd built over 2 years of quiet research, not because I was suspicious at first, but because the lies were starting to unravel like the hem of a cheap dress, and I wanted to know how deep the fray ran. He knew about me now, that I wasn't his by blood, and that wound was fresh, still bleeding, probably still too raw to even scab over properly. But what he didn't know, what I hadn't had the chance to tell him over the phone, and what I'd already decided I never would say aloud, was that Melanie wasn't his either. That the daughter he'd built his world around, defended, protected, praised, funded, and favored, had been a stranger's child all along, born from a second betrayal so casual, so buried beneath years of carefully constructed family myths, that even I had trouble believing it at first. But the test didn't lie. Neither did the dates, or the receipts I found, or the photo I stumbled across online of a man my mother once worked with, a man she still saw for coffee once a month under the guise of old coworkers catching up, a man whose nose Melanie had inherited, whose smile curled the exact same way when she was amused but trying to hide it. Genetics is a brutal thing. It leaves breadcrumbs even when you try to sweep them away. And I had followed every single one of them. There was no return address on the envelope I sent. I didn't need one. He would know who it came from before he even opened it. He would see the plain white paper, the familiar handwriting on the label, and he would know the truth had finally arrived, not as an explosion, but as a quiet click. Like a door unlocking at the end of a long hallway you didn't even realize you'd been walking down your entire life. And I didn't pick up the phone when it rang again. Or the time after that. Or the time after that. Because I didn't need to hear his pain. I didn't need him to ask if I hated him, or if I'd done this out of spite, or if any part of me still saw him as my father. I already knew what I'd say, and it wouldn't be what he needed to hear. Because he was my father, in the ways that mattered once. But he was also the man who sat through years of dinners where my name was only mentioned when it needed to be used as contrast. He was the man who watched me carry my own weight without ever offering to lift a hand. And when you love someone in silence for that long, you start to understand how loud absence really is. That evening, while I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee I didn't drink, watching the sun dip behind the houses I'd grown up resenting, he was sitting in their living room, envelope open, papers spread across his lap like confetti at a funeral. He didn't yell. He didn't break anything. He just sat there, staring at the photo from the box, the one with my mother in that hospital bed, smiling at a man just out of frame, the one with the shadow that didn't belong to him. His hands were shaking, not violently, but with that kind of tremor that comes from realizing you've been someone else's fool for far too long. My mother was crying, of course. I'm sure she tried to spin it into something survivable, a mistake, a moment of weakness, a confusing time in her life. She probably even said it was for the best, that she chose him anyway, that she built this family out of love, and that should count for something. But that kind of love is currency you can't spend once the truth is out. And Melanie? I imagined she stood there, confused, hurt, trying to wrap her head around a reality where her last name didn't mean what she thought it did. She asked him what was wrong, why everyone was acting like someone had died, and he just looked at her, eyes hollow, mouth dry, and said the only words he could manage. You wouldn't understand. And he was right. Because Melanie never had to understand what it felt like to be the backup singer in a family duet, always harmonizing but never holding the melody. She never had to wonder if her name was said with pride or pity. She never had to earn a place in a house where her picture already hung on every wall like it was sacred. She deserved more, my mother once said. And she was right. Melanie deserved the truth. Just like I did. The only difference? I didn't need a new condo. I just needed to stop pretending I was part of their family.